I'm delighted to be here, even though it's the other side of the world and I'm upside down. I have been breastfed as a baby, but I have to operate 2 clickers. So this is going to be a real challenge to do so. I've been asked to talk about dose. It's something we measure routinely in our research. It's ubiquitous throughout every study. It's important for us to know exactly how much milk the baby is actually receiving when we study the babies themselves. I'd like to acknowledge that clearly I don't do all the work. There's this huge, good-looking bunch here from Australia. That's my team. They're not only good-looking, they're smart. Most of them have been breastfed. It's a requirement to answer that question upon interview. And they're really dedicated to doing the work. I need to acknowledge Lars, of course, because we're going to continue the theme of HMOs, but in a more semi-reductionist way, looking at the microbiome, which this young man did in his PhD. A long-standing tolerance statistician. When you see the graphs, you'll understand why. And a clinical biologist that we're raising the level of his research from preterm birth, in other words, below the belly button, to up higher to the breast. So a lot of this work these people here have been involved in. Why are we here? Why are we trying to translate science? It's because we're not doing a great job. Our breastfeeding rates are still quite low. In the 1 to 2 years here, you see world breastfeeding rates are only 65%. We're getting only half of the mums, if we're lucky, breastfeeding to 6 months and initiating breastfeeding within an hour after birth. And many of those reasons are still the same as when I started. That mothers believe that their infants are not satisfied by breast milk alone, or they have a perception of low milk supply. So to understand some of these problems that plague us in supporting women to breastfeed, we do try and study lactation as a biological system. And we're very aware of that triad sitting in the cocoon of the mechanisms, the epigenetics, the genetics, as Lars mentioned, lifestyle, behaviours, how we breastfeed our babies, and then the broader environment of being in the rural part of the world or the country versus the urban part of the country. Our mission in the group is to conduct integrative mother-baby-centred research because that's what matters. The end point. We want to empower families and communities and clinicians to improve health. So our research program is rather linear when we look at it like this, but we study breast function. We look at what's going on in pregnancy, breast growth, differentiation, and pregnancy complications that are rising and appear to have similar pathways affecting the placenta. They also affect the breast. We're looking post-birth at colostrum, secretory activation, and the establishment of milk production, that critical time, that first 2 weeks. Then we look at breast milk removal. We know that autocrine system is incredibly important to sustain milk production. So we look, as was mentioned, at the suck, swallow, breathe coordination. Babies that are having problems, we look at expression, we look at modes and regimes, and then we look at how to deliver that milk to the term or preterm baby if it's been expressed. Milk composition is a big component of our research. We can measure over 40 different components in the lab. And there's so many to measure, but we want to understand, as Lars said, the maternal and infant influences on that variability that we see. What happens when we process it in the milk bank? What happens if we use heat, UVC? What happens when we store, thaw, and warm? And then, of course, it's all about the infant. Growth and development and health. Again, this is where dose effects are so important to understand the puzzle, because if we're going to intervene, we need to know we're doing the right thing. And we also study the mum and her health and what that means in terms of well-being, sleep and body composition as well. So if we start at the beginning of the lactation cycle, we have to think about breast development, the critical windows, the fetal, pubescent, during pregnancy when we have an explosion of differentiation and become fully functional. We know very little about this process. We know a lot about it in cows, and we don't need to know about it in oats for oat milk, but we need to know about it in women for breast milk. Secretory activation, another critical, very short time point. The literature suggests this should be done and dusted in 48 hours to 72 hours, but we clinically wait 1 to 5 days. There are profound changes in composition and the breast. Then, if we look at the next few days, this is when milk production is established. The reason I say this is critical is because milk production at 2 weeks is predictive of 6 weeks. This is when we need to act, when we're supporting mothers. Then we have full milk production here, and then we have weaning, and we have changes in composition as well as volume again. So if we look at secretory activation, this variation in milk composition is not only about what the mother's influencing on the milk or the baby, it's about the biology of the gland. It's a mirror, it's an opportunity to look at components and diagnose or at least flag problems. So you can see here that sodium drops rapidly in the first few days, as does protein, and we have lactose increasing and we have citrate increasing. So when we look at these studies where we say we're not getting good measurements, are we looking at the right time when milk composition is naturally changing? This is an example of good measurements. This is milk production in the first week after birth. Look at the literature and the big variation. This is what happens after 2 weeks after birth. Lots of variation. Here's our data here from test weighing. Low variation. You have to measure correctly if you're going to intervene or change protocol. So this is how we do it. We send the scales home with the mums and the babies. They're obviously breastfeeding, so they have exceptionally good-looking babies. We just weigh the baby before and after each feed, or I should say not we, the mother does it. The pre-feed minus the post-feed minus the pre-feed weight gives us an indication of the mils of milk or grams that the baby takes. When we look at dose, we take a little sample before and after every feed, and we calculate, we analyse that milk for the concentration of the component, and then we multiply it by the actual volume for that feed, and then we add it all up. So we get a dose for the feed. Generally, if you see anybody estimating it, they're using a constant of 800 mils of milk or 780 mils of milk. Lars mentioned if we sample lipids, depends when we sample, pre or post feed, you can see a massive change in the fat content, and you can see massive changes throughout the day. Please close your eyes. This baby slept for over 6 hours. It's just a presentation baby, not a real indication of the mean. So if we add up all of that lipid intake, look at the massive difference that the babies are getting, anywhere from 50 grams of lipid right down to 15, and they're growing fine. If you take a sample, and our PhD student had a look at this, this is 2 pre-post samples, trying to even out all the differences, you still overestimate significantly the amount of fat the baby's getting. We're wanting to grow babies, we need to measure things properly. So we did naively embark on the most deeply phenotyped feeding cohort, is now down in Western Australia thanks to that poor PhD student that I recruited. So we collected milk in pregnancy and then samples across all the months to 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, we're out to 2 years. We measured milk production at 3, 9 and 12 months. Measured maternal body composition, that was the most invasive thing we did, telling mothers how fat they were. And then we also measured the infants. We also took saliva, poo, and other things. So we have a freezer full of lots. We're going to look at this first 5 months though. And we're just going to go back to the basics and we're going to look at protein, fat and carbohydrate. Here are the concentrations here. And you see they don't change across 5 months of lactation. Neither does the intake of the baby. But recommended values for protein, our babies are taking less on average and they're taking a little bit more fat. So if we're also going to intervene, we need to make sure our reference ranges are based on good data and not estimations. If we calculate the energy intake, in fact, all of our babies in WA are taking far more calories than recommended by the NHMRC. What does that mean when we're supporting women? This is a case study of a woman on a smaller cohort that we were running to look at lipids, and she had a small for gestational age baby. Things were flagged in that it followed the lower centile, but there were issues going on with the mum and the baby, and you can see that head circumference, however, was spared here, and you see a jump across the centiles when she's weaned. What did that look like? She was not keen on supplementing her baby. When we measured the fat across the months, it was in normal range, a little bit higher. Protein was a little bit lower, and we had lactose sitting within range. But we measured milk production, 419 mils. Very rare for a baby to thrive on less than 600. That baby was only getting half the caloric intake it needed. Also, when we've looked at carbohydrates and we've looked at concentrations here and the baby's body composition, you can see with total carbohydrates, the concentration we get, the more we have concentrated, the less fat mass in the baby. But with daily intakes, the more carbohydrate, the more fat mass. We're getting potentially the wrong answer with concentrations. How does this translate then to macro and trace elements? We know they're critical, and again, they're based on adequate intakes, constant volume calculations, and population averages, often on interventional studies, sometimes in low-income countries. Well, you can see that none of our babies obeyed the textbooks. Over time, copper concentrations decline, and really, by 3 months, do any of our babies meet the recommendations? And this was the same for all of these components here, particularly iron. If we look at zinc here, virtually no one met the recommended intake. These are based on older methods of analysis that were used. And iron, we had a similar situation where most of our babies didn't meet this requirement, yet they were healthy and growing well. So at 1 month, this is what it looks like about all of these elements meeting the criteria, and by 6 months, our recommendations and our reference ranges are out of date. Then we wanted to see, did this impact the babies? What if we looked at the intakes of these particular things, and we wanted to see if the mother's body composition impacted that, or did they impact the baby? No. Looks like there might be a threshold effect rather than a relationship. Why does this matter? Because we recommend supplementation to babies sometimes, as in we do with iron in certain countries, And we know, and zinc, and we know that supplementation of zinc in Bangladesh increases or growth, and we have improved growth. But if we give iron in Sweden to babies that don't need iron, we see decreased growth and increased diarrhoea. Again, intake really does matter. Now let's go to the mother-milk-infant triad that Lars has published on, and looking at that co-adapting triad. And let's start looking at mediators of health. And we know that the gut microbiome is really important in our health. So early colonisation of the baby with breast milk has significantly better health outcomes for the baby. Again, you find a long-suffering PhD student to do a rather simple analysis, it had to be done in the cloud. And this is a cross-sectional study of 63 dyads. We had infant body composition and, of course, the productions as well. So we are looking here at the 3-month point. This is what we got. My breastfed child said to me as she was driving me around rural Victoria, she leaned over and said, "You're not going to show people that, are you?" And I said, "Yes." And really, we'll walk through this, but it's what we're talking about, the complexity of human milk in itself, let alone the complexity of the system and how to analyse that. So if we look at the mother and the breast milk, you can see here that there are certain characteristics in the mother that have positive relationships. So the greater the weight of the mother, the more 2FL. And the greater the fat mass of the mother, the more 2FL. We also see relationships with the bacteria, the abundance of bacteria in the milk, with her fat mass and weight as well. So we have interactions between, we know human milk oligosaccharides feed the bacteria in the gut, but we don't know if they feed the bacteria in the milk. So making it more complex, we see relationships, of course, now between the bacteria in the milk and the oligosaccharides here. But we don't see any with 2FL, where we see lots of relationships here. So we see negative relationships as well with these, meaning less of this bacteria is associated with more DSLNT. Is that the mechanism by which NEC might be protective? We don't know, but this is the kind of research that helps us move in the right directions. Now, if we look at the breast milk and the infant, and we look at the oligosaccharides and the baby's body composition, you can see here we have a number of relationships that are negative and a number that are positive. But if we look at the intake, vastly different picture. We find that increases in these components are associated with increases in fat mass, for example, and fat-free mass indexes. Importantly, 2FL being the most abundant is associated with fat mass, and it's being put in formula right now. We know from our studies of intakes that the intake decreases over time in breastfed infants, but we know that babies take more formula over time and therefore are potentially taking more 2FL across those 6 months. So these studies help inform what's going on with supplementation, or at least warn us against some issues we might encounter. What about the human milk microbiome? It's associated with the infant's body composition as well, mainly positively. So we see that both the human milk oligosaccharides and bacteria are helping grow our babies. So in a nutshell, maternal factors influence both the HMOs and the bacterial profile of the milk. And the HMOs and the human milk display relationships as well. So the dose of HMO, however, and the relative abundance of those microbes appear to have a role in modulating infant growth and development, as well as development of body composition. And this may be a mechanism by which breastfeeding and breast milk exert a programming effect on later obesity. So I'll leave you with this message that dose or intake of human milk components relate to infant growth and body composition and often display different relationships to concentration. We think there's a critical need for more 24-hour studies, more measurement of milk intake. This test weighing is not detrimental for the mothers. They like weighing their babies and seeing how much milk is made. We've published that confidence is not diminished by doing these studies. The only time it is when the mother is not making enough milk and she believes she is. So it can be used positively to reassure mothers or as a tool to convince mothers to intervene with perhaps pumping and feeding express milk. So the team's working on developing normative reference ranges that can inform nutritional guidelines and looking at providing guidance with respect to more frequent milk removal and supplementation when necessary. And we think this work will inform sampling for research and development of diagnostics and their associated interpretation. In other words, we need to sometimes look at more than concentration. So with that, I think I might have caught up our time by a minute.